At the divorce hearing, my husband leaned back in his chair and smiled like a man who had already won. "You'll never touch my money again," he said loud enough for the courtroom to hear. His mistress squeezed his arm. "That's right, sweetheart." His mother smiled too. Slow, satisfied. She doesn't deserve a cent. I said nothing. I just placed the envelope on the table. The judge opened it, scanned the first page, and suddenly burst out laughing. He looked up, eyes sharp with interest, and said quietly, "Oh, this is good." That was the moment their confidence collapsed. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper-polished wood, and something metallic I could never quite name. Fear, maybe, or anticipation. I sat perfectly still at the narrow table reserved for the wife, my hands folded in my lap, my spine straight, despite the tight ache spreading across my lower back. I had learned long ago how to sit through discomfort without showing it. 31 years of marriage teaches you that skill whether you want it or not. Across from me, Thomas looked relaxed. Too relaxed. His tailored navy suit fit him the way success always had, effortlessly, as if it belonged to him by birthright. Silver threaded neatly through his dark hair, now giving him the kind of distinguished look people trusted without question. He hadn't looked at me once since we entered the room. On his right sat Vanessa, young enough to be my daughter. Her heels were too high for a courthouse floor, her dress too tight for a weekday morning. She kept checking her reflection in the dark screen of her phone, smoothing her hair, as if this were a restaurant opening or a gallery event instead of the legal burial of my marriage. And then there was Margaret, my mother-in-law, sitting stiff-backed behind them, her purse clutched tightly against her chest. Her pearl earrings caught the fluorescent light every time she tilted her head, which she did often, surveying the room like a judge in her own right. She had worn those pearls to my wedding. I noticed that she wore them again today. The judge cleared his throat, calling the room to order. A middle-aged man with tired eyes and a voice that suggested he had seen every version of human disappointment imaginable. Divorce hearings had a way of blurring together for people like him. Another broken promise, another stack of paperwork, another couple who once swore forever. But this one was different. I could feel it, like pressure before a storm. "Mrs. Caldwell," the judge said, looking down at his file, "you've submitted a personal letter to be reviewed before final rulings. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. Thomas finally turned to look at me then, his smile sharpened just slightly like a blade catching the light. "This won't change anything," he muttered, leaning closer. "You signed, you agreed, you walked away with nothing." Vanessa smirked, not bothering to lower her voice. "She really does love drama, doesn't she?" Margaret let out a quiet, satisfied hum, always did. I kept my eyes on the judge. He opened the envelope carefully, as if he already sensed it was heavier than it looked. He scanned the first page in silence, then the second. His eyebrows rose, his lips twitched. And then he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite clearing of the throat. A real laugh, short, sharp, surprised. The sound cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Thomas stiffened. "Is something amusing, Your Honor?" The judge looked up slowly, his amusement fading into something far more dangerous. Interest. "Oh, this is good," he said. Vanessa's hand tightened on Thomas's sleeve. Margaret leaned forward, her smile faltering for the first time that morning. And just like that, the room shifted. But to understand how we arrived at this moment, this precise intersection of arrogance and reckoning, you have to go back. Not to the affair, not even to the divorce papers. You have to go back to the quiet years, the invisible ones. I met Thomas when I was 26 and believed that love was built by sacrifice. He was ambitious even then, sharp, charming, always 3 steps ahead in conversations. I admired that. I admired him. When he talked about the future, I listened like it was a promise written just for me. We married young by today's standards. I followed him from city to city as his career grew. I put my own plans on hold so he could chase his. I learned to host dinners, to smile at fundraisers, to remember names and preferences and unspoken hierarchies. I learned which wine to pour and when to stay silent. When his mother needed help after his father died, I was the one who drove her to appointments. When Thomas worked late often, I reheated dinners and told myself that this was what partnership looked like. We didn't have children. That was a grief I carried quietly, one Thomas dismissed as unfortunate timing. Maybe later, he'd said, when things slow down. They never did. By the time I turned 55, my life had become a series of routines designed to support someone else's success. I handled the household finances, coordinated investments, paid bills, filed taxes, everything except having my name attached to the money. Thomas liked control. I told myself it was just how his mind worked. Looking back, I can see the warning signs clearly. The way he started guarding his phone, the sudden gym membership, the new cologne that made my throat tighten with unfamiliar sweetness. But denial is a powerful thing, especially when you've invested decades into believing a story. When he finally asked for the divorce, it wasn't dramatic. "I think we've grown apart," he said one evening, standing in our kitchen as if he were announcing a schedule change. "I want to be fair about this. Clean, simple." Clean, simple. He had already prepared the paperwork, already consulted attorneys, already decided what fair meant. I read the settlement agreement alone at the dining table we'd bought for our 10th anniversary. I traced the wood grain with my finger while reading line after line of legal language that reduced my life to percentages and exclusions. I was entitled to almost nothing. No alimony. No claim to the accounts I had managed for years. No compensation for the career I never had because I was too busy supporting his. I signed anyway. That decision confused everyone. My sister begged me to fight. Friends whispered about weakness. Even Thomas looked momentarily unsettled by how easily I agreed. But silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. The letter I placed in that envelope wasn't written in anger. It was written in clarity. It was written after long nights' quiet research and a conversation Thomas never thought I would have. And now, as the judge turned another page and adjusted his glasses, I saw the first flicker of doubt cross Thomas's face. The smugness drained away, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Fear. The first thing people misunderstand about long marriages is where the erosion actually happens. They imagine shouting matches, slammed doors, dramatic betrayals. But most of the damage is quieter than that. It's done in the pauses, in the assumptions, in the way one person's needs slowly become invisible. Thomas and I built our life on a foundation of roles we never questioned. He earned. I organized. He decided. I adjusted. At first it felt efficient, modern even. He was good at making money. I was good at making life work around it. When we bought our first house, a modest place with peeling shutters and an overgrown yard, I spent weekends sanding floors and planting flowers while Thomas worked late, chasing the promotion that would set us up for life. When he finally got it, we upgraded. Bigger house, better neighborhood, higher expectations. I learned how to host without effort, how to make conversations glide. I remembered birthdays for his colleagues' wives, sent handwritten notes after dinners donated to the right charities. I became the quiet machinery behind his public success. People noticed him. They trusted him. They assumed I was simply there. Margaret certainly did. From the beginning, my mother-in-law treated our marriage like a transaction she needed to monitor. She never disliked me outright. That would have required acknowledging me as something more than a placeholder. Instead, she corrected my manners, my cooking, my tone. She offered helpful suggestions about my appearance, my posture, the way I laughed too loudly when nervous. "Men like calm," she once said, adjusting the placement of a vase in my living room. "Stability. You mustn't demand too much." Thomas never intervened. He would smile politely, kiss my cheek afterward, and tell me she meant well. Over time, her influence grew. She attended our holidays, our dinners, our decisions. When Thomas wanted to move money into a new investment account, she supported him. When I asked questions, she raised her eyebrows as if curiosity itself were unbecoming. "You trust your husband, don't you?" she'd ask. Of course I did. Trust is the currency you spend without noticing until you're bankrupt. The financial arrangement was subtle. Thomas insisted on keeping major assets solely in his name, citing tax efficiency, liability protection, future planning. It all sounded reasonable. He was a financial professional after all. I handled the day-to-day mortgage payments, insurance budgeting, but the core accounts remained just out of reach. "I'm taking care of you," he'd say. "You don't need to worry." So I didn't, not then. As the years passed, the marriage settled into a predictable rhythm. We occupied the same spaces without truly sharing them. Conversations became logistical. Dinners were eaten separately more often than not. When I suggested trips or changes, Thomas deferred. Later, next quarter, after the deal closes. Later became never. The first time I noticed something truly wrong was unremarkable on the surface. A credit card statement arrived with a charge from a boutique I'd never visited. I assumed it was a mistake. When I mentioned it casually, Thomas waved it off. "Client gift," he said. "I'll reimburse it." He never did. Then came the late nights, the vague explanations, the way his phone never left his hand even in the house, the way he angled the screen away from me without realizing he was doing it. Still, I told myself stories about stress, about age, about how long marriages naturally evolve. Margaret noticed, of course, she always did. "Men wander when they're not challenged," she said one afternoon while we were folding napkins together before a dinner party. "You must make sure he feels admired." I looked at her, then really looked and realized something unsettling. She wasn't worried about my happiness. She was worried about his comfort. The illness came quietly. A routine checkup, a follow-up test. A word spoken gently as if volume might soften its weight. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it was serious enough to rearrange the world in my mind. I drove home alone that day, gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing how I would tell Thomas. I imagined him pausing, listening, holding my hand. I imagined support. What I got instead was a voicemail. "Running late," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. The night he asked for the divorce, there was no fight, no raised voices, just a carefully delivered announcement timed between emails and obligations. "I need a different life," he said. "This isn't working anymore." I waited for him to say more, to ask how I felt, to notice the way my hands trembled slightly on the counter. He didn't. Vanessa appeared in his life shortly after that. Or rather, she appeared publicly. In truth, she'd been there much longer. I pieced it together slowly through social media posts, overheard conversations patterns that only made sense in hindsight. She was efficient, confident, eager to fit into the role I'd vacated. Margaret approved of her immediately. "She has ambition," Margaret said, as if that explained everything. By the time the divorce papers arrived, Thomas had already rewritten our history. He spoke of independence, of fairness, of clean breaks. He framed himself as generous even as he ensured I walked away with the bare minimum. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had started asking questions. Quiet ones, careful ones. Questions about documents I'd signed years ago without reading too closely. Questions about accounts that had existed before our marriage, accounts Thomas had inherited but never fully explained. It turns out that invisibility has its advantages. When people assume you're harmless, they forget to hide their tracks. The envelope I prepared didn't contain accusations. It contained facts, dates, clauses, copies of things Thomas had never bothered to read because he never imagined they could matter. As I sat in that courtroom watching the judge's expression change, I thought about all the moments I'd been told to be patient, to be understanding, to be quiet. Patience, I had learned, is not passive. It's observant. The body has a way of keeping secrets until it decides it can't anymore. Mind began speaking in subtle warnings. I tried to ignore fatigue that lingered too long, a dull pressure beneath my ribs, the way food sometimes tasted like metal. I blamed age, stress, the quiet erosion of years spent accommodating everyone else's needs before my own. When the diagnosis finally came, it arrived without drama. A small room, mint green walls, a physician who spoke with measured kindness as if careful cadence could soften the meaning of her words. "It's treatable," she said, "but it will require attention, time, rest." Time was the one thing I no longer had. I sat in my car afterward, keys resting unused in my palm, and thought about Thomas, about how to tell him, about whether to soften the truth or say it plainly. I decided on honesty. After all, we were still married then, or something close to it. That night he came home late. Again. I waited at the kitchen table, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. When he finally walked in, he barely looked at me. "Long day," he said, already scrolling through his phone. "I need to talk to you," I replied. "Can it wait?" he asked. "I'm exhausted." Something inside me tightened. "It's important." He sighed, the sound of a man inconvenienced. Tomorrow, then. Tomorrow slipped into next week into silence. I went to my first follow-up appointment alone. I learned the language of treatment and prognosis without him. I memorized schedules, side effects, contingency plans. I smiled politely when nurses asked if my husband would be joining me later. He's busy, I said. Busy dismantling our life as it turned out. The emotional distance between us grew tangible. He stopped sleeping in our bedroom, citing late nights and early meetings. His side of the closet emptied gradually, suit by suit, until the hangers swayed slightly when I brushed past them. We moved around each other like polite strangers sharing a hallway. Then came the night he said the words. I need space. He said it standing by the counter, not even facing me, as if reading from a script he'd rehearsed. Not unhappy, not confused, just done. I've changed, he continued. We both have. This marriage doesn't fit anymore. I asked him if there was someone else. He hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. Vanessa. I didn't cry. Not then. Shock has a way of numbing emotion, wrapping it in cotton so it doesn't bleed out all at once. I nodded. I listened. I absorbed the information like a witness taking notes. The divorce papers arrived days later, efficient, cold, already weighted in his favor. Margaret called that same evening. I hope you'll be reasonable, she said. Dragging this out won't benefit anyone. I wondered briefly if she knew about my diagnosis, if it would change anything. It wouldn't have. I signed the papers the following morning. Thomas looked surprised when I handed them back. He'd expected resistance, bargaining, tears. He studied my face, searching for cracks. You're taking this very well, he said. I'm tired, I replied, which was true, though not in the way he meant. What he didn't know was that the act of signing freed something in me. The decision to stop fighting the wrong battle opened space for a different kind of clarity. I began reviewing old documents in quiet hours, files I'd organized years ago and never revisited. That was when I found it. An old trust document established long before our marriage, tied to an inheritance Thomas had received early in our relationship. I remembered signing something back then, a form presented, quickly explained vaguely. I'd trusted him, trusted his lawyer, trusted that what was his would one day be ours. But buried in the language was a condition one Thomas had never mentioned, one he'd never thought relevant. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't confront him. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer recommended by an acquaintance, someone discreet, thorough, and unimpressed by arrogance. She read the document slowly, carefully. This is interesting, she said, tapping the page. Very interesting. It wasn't a loophole, it wasn't a trick, it was a clause, clear, enforceable, forgotten. And it changed everything. I wrote the letter that night, not to Thomas, to the court. I explained nothing emotionally. I listed facts, attached copies, highlighted relevant sections. I sealed it and placed it in my purse. The day of the hearing arrived sooner than expected. I dressed simply, neutral colors, comfortable shoes. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Older, yes. Thinner, but steadier. As we entered the courtroom, Thomas's confidence radiated. Vanessa whispered something in his ear that made him smile. Margaret adjusted her pearls. I took my seat and waited. When the judge asked if there was anything further to submit, I stood and handed over the envelope. That was when Thomas leaned toward me and said the words he believed would end me. You'll never touch my money again. I didn't respond. Because by then I knew the truth. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's timing. The envelope had been sealed for weeks by the time I placed it on the courtroom table, but the decision to create it had been made much earlier, on a morning that began like any other and ended with a quiet understanding that my marriage had already been buried. That morning I stood alone in the dining room, sunlight catching dust motes in the air, and realized that the house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a showroom for a life that had already moved on without me. The divorce itself was astonishingly efficient. Thomas prided himself on that. He liked processes that ended cleanly with minimal emotional residue. The paperwork arrived in a crisp folder delivered by courier, as if our 3 decades together were a transaction best handled without personal contact. There was a cover letter from his attorney, polite, professional, condescending in its careful neutrality. The terms were presented as generous. No spousal support, no claim to his accounts. A small one-time settlement to ease the transition. The language suggested benevolence where there was none. It assumed compliance. It assumed my exhaustion would do the rest. I read every page slowly, not because I needed to understand them, I already did, but because I wanted to feel the full weight of what was being asked. To acknowledge that this document was the formal confirmation of what Thomas had been preparing for long before he ever said he needed space. I signed without hesitation. The act surprised everyone, including me. Thomas stared at the signed pages as if expecting a second set of documents to appear, an objection, a counteroffer, a plea. Instead, there was only my signature, neat and final. "You don't want to discuss this?" he asked. "There's nothing to discuss," I replied. Margaret called later that afternoon, her tone falsely warm. "I'm glad you're being sensible," she said. "Bitterness doesn't suit women our age." I didn't correct her. What followed was a period of unusual calm. Friends reached out with sympathy. My sister offered her guest room, her advice, her anger. I declined all of it. I needed quiet. I needed to think. And more than that, I needed to remember. I returned to the filing cabinet in my study, the one I'd organized years earlier when Thomas's finances began to grow more complex. I pulled out folders labeled with dates and categories: insurance, taxes, property trusts. Most of it was familiar, some of it wasn't. The trust document stood out immediately. Yellowed slightly at the edges, stamped and notarized, its language dense and deliberate. I remembered the day I signed it. Thomas had been distracted, eager to leave for a meeting. His attorney had summarized quickly, assuring me it was a formality, something to acknowledge the existence of an inheritance that predated our marriage. "You don't need to worry about this," Thomas had said then. "It doesn't affect us." He was wrong. I read the document again, slower this time. Then again. I underlined passages, made notes in the margins. And there it was. A condition. A moral clause written plainly without flourish. One that outlined circumstances under which the beneficiary Thomas would forfeit his rights. Divorce initiated without cause, infidelity, deception. I felt no rush of triumph, only a strange sense of alignment, as if pieces long scattered were finally finding their places. The lawyer I consulted confirmed what I already suspected. The clause was valid, enforceable, and crucially still active. It had never been amended, never challenged, never even acknowledged by Thomas since the day he signed it. He assumed it was irrelevant, she said. People like him often do. I asked her what would happen if the court became aware of it. She smiled faintly. That depends on how it's presented. The letter took shape over several nights. I wrote it by hand first, then typed it, then revised it until it contained nothing unnecessary. No accusations, no emotional language, just facts, timelines, documentation. I addressed it to the court, not to Thomas. I included copies of the trust proof of his affair, evidence of how the divorce had been initiated. Everything was organized, indexed, impossible to ignore. When I sealed the envelope, I felt lighter than I had in months. The morning of the hearing, Thomas barely acknowledged me. Vanessa leaned close to him, whispering reassurances. Margaret watched me with thinly veiled satisfaction, convinced that the matter was already settled. And in a way it was. They believed the story they had written, the one where I was the quiet, compliant wife who walked away with nothing because she didn't know how to fight. They had mistaken my silence for ignorance. When the judge reached for the envelope, I didn't look at Thomas. I didn't look at Vanessa or Margaret. I focused on the steady rhythm of my breath, the grounded certainty that comes when you know you've told the truth and placed it in the right hands. Whatever happened next was no longer mine to control. And that surprisingly brought peace. The weeks between signing the divorce papers and the hearing passed in a strange, suspended quiet, as if time itself were holding its breath. On the surface, my life appeared smaller. I moved into a modest apartment on the edge of town, one with thin walls and a view of a parking lot instead of a garden. I sold furniture that wouldn't fit donated clothes I no longer needed, and learned how little space one person actually requires to live. But beneath that simplicity, something else was happening. Every morning I woke before dawn, made a cup of tea, and spread documents across my small kitchen table. I reviewed timelines, bank statements, emails. I cross-referenced dates, building a clear, unemotional map of events. This wasn't about catching Thomas in a lie. He had already admitted the affair in all the ways that mattered. This was about clarity, about presenting a story so coherent that no one could look away from it. The lawyer I worked with was precise and unflappable. She didn't flatter me or offer sympathy. She treated my situation the way she treated all legal matters, with respect for facts and a healthy disdain for arrogance. "He believes he's insulated," she said during one of our meetings. "That's what makes people careless." We met in her office late one afternoon, sunlight slanting through the blinds as she reviewed the final packet. She tapped the trust document with her pen, then glanced up at me. "Are you certain you want to submit this as a personal letter rather than a formal motion?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I want the judge to read it, not skim it." She nodded. "Then it needs to be clean, direct, impossible to dismiss." It was. Outside that small, focused world, Thomas was celebrating his freedom. Vanessa posted photos from restaurants I recognized, places we'd once gone together. Margaret appeared in several of them, smiling proudly, as if ushering a new daughter into a position she'd always believed was provisional. Friends stopped calling me after a while, some out of discomfort, some out of loyalty to Thomas. I didn't blame them. People prefer uncomplicated narratives. They like knowing where to stand. I stood alone, and for the first time in years that didn't frighten me. The night before the hearing, I slept deeply. No rehearsed speeches, no imagined confrontations. I'd already said everything that mattered, sealed in an envelope and handed to the process I trusted more than any person in that courtroom. When morning came, I dressed carefully but without ceremony. A simple blouse, a jacket that made me feel steady. I tied my hair back and studied my reflection, noting the lines around my eyes, the calm set of my mouth. "This is who you are now," I thought, "someone who knows." At the courthouse, Thomas greeted colleagues in the hallway like a man attending a conference. Vanessa hovered close, absorbing attention, while Margaret took in the surroundings with proprietary interest. They looked like a unit, polished, prepared. They weren't prepared. Inside the courtroom, the air felt different from the moment we sat down. Thomas spoke with confidence when addressed, answering questions with practiced ease. His attorney emphasized efficiency, finality, fairness. Vanessa watched me openly now, curiosity replacing disdain. Margaret folded her hands, satisfied. When it was my turn, I stood and spoke briefly. I confirmed my identity. I confirmed that I had signed the agreement knowingly. Then I mentioned the letter. "I believe there is additional information relevant to the court's understanding of this settlement," I said. Thomas shifted. His attorney frowned. The judge accepted the envelope with a nod. As he read, the room grew quieter. The sound of paper seemed unnaturally loud. I watched his expression change, not dramatically but incrementally, interest, replacing neutrality, amusement, flickering briefly before settling into something more deliberate. When he laughed, it startled everyone. Thomas leaned forward. "Your Honor." "Oh, don't interrupt," the judge said mildly. "I'm enjoying this." Vanessa's face drained of color. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. The judge began to speak, outlining the clause, the implications, the oversight. He explained it in plain language, as if teaching a lesson he'd delivered many times before to people who thought themselves untouchable. Thomas's certainty evaporated. He looked at his attorney, then at Vanessa, then at his mother. No one met his eyes. The judge concluded by stating that the settlement would need to be reconsidered in light of the newly presented information. The matter was far from over, but the direction had changed. As the gavel came down, I felt something settle inside me. Not victory, not relief, something steadier. Resolution. I gathered my things quietly and stood. Thomas stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," I replied gently. "But it's begun." I walked out of the courtroom alone, the echo of my footsteps sounding different, now lighter, freer, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of a life reclaimed. The second hearing was scheduled 3 weeks later, but the story had already begun circulating by the end of the first day. Court clerks whispered. Attorneys lingered a little longer in hallways. Even the bailiff, a man who had clearly seen every possible variation of marital collapse, gave me a brief nod as I passed him in the lobby, his expression unreadable, but not unkind. Thomas did not call me that night, or the next. When he finally did 2 days later, his voice sounded unfamiliar, tight-stripped of its usual authority. "We need to talk," he said. "I don't think we do," I replied. "You blindsided me," he snapped. "That clause, my father never mentioned it. You knew about it and said nothing." "I learned about it after you asked for the divorce," I said calmly, "and I gave it to the court. That's how the law works." Silence followed. Then a different tone, lower, more controlled. "This is going to get ugly." "It doesn't have to," I said, "but it will be honest." He hung up without answering. In the days that followed, the carefully constructed world Thomas had inhabited began to show cracks. Vanessa deleted several photos from her social media accounts, though not fast enough to erase what had already been seen. Margaret called twice, leaving voicemails that shifted from indignation to disbelief to something approaching panic. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said in the last message. "You're humiliating this family." I listened once. I didn't call back. At the second hearing, the courtroom felt different, heavier, less theatrical. Thomas no longer leaned back in his chair. His suit was the same, but it hung differently on him now, as if the confidence that once filled it had thinned. Vanessa sat farther away this time, her posture rigid, her eyes darting between the attorneys. Margaret was absent. The judge reviewed additional filings, clarifications, responses. He asked pointed questions. He interrupted Thomas's attorney twice, correcting assumptions that would have gone unchallenged before. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice lacked its former polish. He explained, he justified, he minimized. The words fell flat. Then the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "is there anything you wish to add?" I stood. I hadn't planned a speech. I didn't need one. "I trusted my husband," I said simply. "I trusted that what we built together was real. I trusted that the law would protect fairness. I'm not asking for punishment, I'm asking for accuracy." The judge nodded once. The ruling came swiftly after that. The trust clause was upheld. The financial settlement was reopened. Thomas's assumed immunity evaporated under the weight of documentation he had never bothered to read. Vanessa left the courtroom before it was over. Thomas stayed seated long after everyone else stood. I didn't watch him. I gathered my things and walked out into the afternoon light, blinking as the sun hit my eyes. The air smelled like rain and exhaust and something faintly hopeful. A strange combination. Outside, my sister waited near the steps, her arms crossed tightly. When she saw me, she exhaled sharply and pulled me into a hug. "You did it," she said. "No," I replied, "I told the truth." That evening, I sat alone in my apartment and let the quiet settle around me. There was no rush of triumph, no surge of satisfaction, just a deep, steady calm. I thought about the woman I had been when Thomas first told me I would never touch his money again. How small he had believed me to be, how confident he had been that the story ended with his voice. He had been wrong. Justice, I had learned, does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in the form of a document rediscovered, a clause ignored, a woman who stops explaining herself. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window watching headlights move through the parking lot below. Somewhere, Thomas was beginning again, stripped of the certainty he'd mistaken for permanence. Somewhere, Vanessa was learning that borrowed power dissolves quickly. Somewhere, Margaret was reconciling with a world that no longer bent to her expectations. And here I was, still standing, still whole. For the first time in years, I slept without fear. Life didn't transform overnight after the ruling. There were no sudden windfalls, no dramatic reversals that made headlines. What changed was quieter and far more profound. The days that followed unfolded with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years, as if the world had finally stopped tilting beneath my feet. The revised settlement took time to finalize. There were additional hearings, revised documents, signatures exchanged through attorneys instead of across tables. I participated when necessary and stepped back when I could. The urgency that once governed every decision was gone. I no longer felt compelled to rush toward outcomes or explanations. Thomas called once more weeks later. I recognized his number immediately and let it ring through before answering. "I never thought it would end like this," he said. His voice sounded smaller, stripped of the certainty that once defined him. "Neither did I replied. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he added after a pause. "I considered that. Intent doesn't erase impact," I said gently, "and I don't need apologies to move on." There was nothing left to say. We said goodbye politely, like two people acknowledging the end of a long chapter without trying to rewrite it. Vanessa disappeared from my awareness entirely after that. Whatever future she'd imagined alongside Thomas unraveled quickly once it became clear how much of it had depended on assumptions that no longer held. Margaret sent a brief note, not an apology, but an acknowledgement. It spoke of disappointment and dignity and family. I read it once, then filed it away with the others. What surprised me most was how quickly my body responded to the change. The tension I'd carried for years began to loosen. My sleep deepened. My appetite returned. The follow-up appointments became less frequent, the prognosis steadily improving. Healing, it turned out, was not just physical, it was contextual. I took a part-time consulting role with a local nonprofit managing finances and operations work I'd essentially been doing unpaid for decades. The director, a woman my age with sharp eyes and a warm laugh, looked over my resume and said, "You've been running a small corporation for 30 years. Don't underestimate that." I didn't anymore. On quiet evenings, I sat by the window with a book or a cup of tea and watched the world continue without needing my permission. I thought about the woman I'd been when I believed endurance was the same as loyalty, when silence felt like virtue, when I thought love meant shrinking. I don't regret my marriage. It shaped me. It taught me patience, organization, empathy. But I no longer confuse sacrifice with worth. The judge's laughter echoed in my mind sometimes, not because it was cruel, but because it was unexpected. A reminder that arrogance often blinds people to the simplest truths, that documents matter, that words once written carry weight beyond intention, and that silence when chosen carefully can be a form of strength. I never wanted revenge. I wanted clarity. I wanted my life back in my own hands, and I wanted the truth to stand on its own without embellishment or apology. That's what the letter did. It didn't shout, it didn't accuse, it simply existed, and that was enough. If there's one thing I hope my story leaves behind, it's this: you are not powerless because you are quiet. You are not invisible because you've been underestimated. And it is never too late to reclaim yourself even after decades of being told who you were supposed to be. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with a signature, a clause, and a judge who takes the time to read. And sometimes the most powerful moment in a person's life is the one where they stop explaining and start living. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever stayed silent when others expected you to break? Share your experience in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from. There are so many stories like this. Stories of resilience, clarity, and quiet strength, and we share them every day. If you'd like to continue this journey with us, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for listening. This story is complete.